Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss you further about our US civil rights topic for this term. If you haven't already, do check out the previous videos on this series where we gave some key background knowledge all the way up to 1917 and especially on the political scene with Democrats and Republicans and principally the situation post-World War One. As always, these lessons are catered towards the student level, so the content will provide some key knowledge and also practice our historical skills as we go along. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So this lesson is going to focus on our contextual knowledge now, really learning some in-depth knowledge about what is happening for civil rights in between roughly 1917 and 1933. In this video, we're going to focus on the Great Migration and the formation of the civil rights group. What exactly was the Great Migration? Who were the groups that formed to try and get more rights for the African Americans? Well, that's what we're going to find out. So we'll start with the Great Migration and what this exactly was. So the Great Migration, as we can hopefully see with the image on the screen, was this mass transfer of population from the southern states to the northern states. We should remember that these southern states highlighted were all the states that were pro-slavery during the American Civil War. They made up most of the Confederacy. And so after the Civil War, they remained quite racist, quite segregationist, despite some initial actions of Reconstruction in the post-war era. So this Great Migration is this prolonged movement of the African American people. Some 6 million African Americans will leave the southern states and enter the northern, Midwest, and western states as time goes on throughout, not just here in the 1910s and 20s, but as the diagram says, all the way up to the 1970s. These African Americans, they were driven from their homes by these terrible economic opportunities and the harsh Jim Crow segregationist laws that were in the southern states. And so they wanted to move to the northern states. But these were the ones that were growing. Many of them had cities and they had a big urban population that was growing to work in the new industrial sphere. For instance, the factories and, of course, an improved education. Likewise, the South was also very off-putting for many of them. These Jim Crow laws, they kept the blacks segregated, not just in schools, but also in buses, cafeterias, workplaces, restrooms. These areas were marked with whites only or colors only identification. Even children who, are children, they don't really know that this is the way things are and that these are laws in place. They were still punished by it. White parents were making an effort to forbid their children from associating with African American children. And so as time goes on, the likes of Chicago, New York, and many other cities began to see their black population expand quite quickly as these migrants moved up from the south and moved into the north. However, in building a new life for themselves, the African Americans were now creating conflict up north as well. Again, this mass migration of people, that's not going to take up space as things like ghettos form to house all of the African Americans who are now living in cities, but also it's economic competition. As you get more black people up north, one thing they want to do is work. And so by going for jobs, they're now going to challenge the white workers who are in those jobs. So we get a new friction here for the northern states and a challenge to the status quo that they had fallen themselves into. But all the same, there was a new black urban culture that was emerging, trying to exert some influence on the states as time passes. It was a gradual thing that was happening. This wasn't an overnight affair. This had been building ever since those Jim Crow segregationist laws were put into place back in the post-Civil War era. And so we had a big crisis here that was coming about. It didn't help either that in the South they also were suffering from blights, there also was crop crisis occurring and damage from some storms and but there were clear economic opportunities for the blacks in the northern states, especially as the First World War broke out and America got involved in it. The industrialized areas of the north needed new workers to come in and work for them. And so in the North, Midwest, and Western states, as they faced this shortage of industrial laborers, they began to allow this immigration of the African American migrants as well. And this really was to the dismay of the white Southerners. Many newspapers, particularly the Chicago Defender, a very pro African American newspaper, were publishing advertisements and providing accounts of success from these black workers who had moved here from the South and were now doing really well up north. By 1917, the African Americans made up about 10% of America's population, but 90% of those African Americans lived in the southern states. The southern states had ensured that the blacks had political inferiority by taking away the vote from them. And they have done this, as we said, through literacy poll tax and also through literacy tests as well. Essentially making it so difficult that because African Americans were poor, they could not afford to vote and therefore did not have the right to vote. These inhibiting policies really made it difficult for the blacks to thrive in their conditions and really made it tough for them to actually be successful. By the end of 1919, about 1 million African Americans had left the southern states, typically by train, boat, or bus, and had managed to transfer themselves out into the northern states. As said, we have growth of many cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit. They had their new jobs in factories, car plants, and even slaughterhouses. And these were very dangerous working conditions, but all the same, they enjoyed them because they were work all the same, and a great escape from the poverty and the entrapment they faced in those southern states. This also had some benefits in the political front as well. For instance, because the population of the northern states had rose so quickly, there were now some cities like Chicago where the African Americans could have some clear political influence. Because they had suffrage up north, they actually could work to keep their mayors and governors in power who supported them, who were pro African American, who were listening to them. And so we get a real growth in the influence of African Americans in these states. There were still some housing tensions, though, and so it led to many of the African Americans building their own cities and therefore growing their own sense of urban culture as well. One of the most popular of these was Harlem in New York City. This used to be an all white neighborhood. However, by the 1920s, about 200,000 African Americans were living here alone. This African American experience became an important theme, not only for the cultural, but also the artistic and musical front as well for the African Americans. This would culminate in what was called the Harlem Renaissance, that became the feature point of the culture of that era. Perhaps in a future video, I'll also go into some detail of the music and the jazz era, also really strengthened the culture of the African Americans. The South also felt an impact from all these African Americans leaving the area. The labor force obviously shrank in mass numbers. Farming areas really struggled to get by in the absence of so many sharecroppers that they had had over the years. However, there were many Southern whites who actually were happy the African Americans had gone. They believed that they had lost this burden of the African American community, who they saw as a discontented and very inefficient workforce. However, because they lost so many workers, some of the white business owners would actually lower their rent fees and offer higher wages as a consequence, hoping to attract some black workers to return to them, especially as we get into the 1630s when a certain economic crisis hits. We'll also get into now some key civil rights groups that open up and come into being in the aftermath of this great migration. There's three key groups that we should really be aware of as we go forward, especially one of these in particular. The first one I want to make note of is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. This was led by a gentleman called Marcus Garvey, and he founded this group in 1914, but it really became quite influential by the 1920s. He focused on the idea of black pride, this idea of self reliance, and how the African Americans should understand they are just one piece of the African community in the whole world. He was considered quite a charismatic leader, and he actually inspired millions to support his Back to Africa movement, encouraging many African Americans to return to Africa to rebuild a strong and independent African nation. UNIA also focused on economic empowerment and self sufficiency for these African Americans. They wanted to support businesses, educations, and the general culture that African Americans had. He also established the Black Star Line, a shipping company, and many factories that allow African Americans to have economic independence. They would also have massive rallies and parades and really would try and boost that cultural pride and identity they had as African Americans. However, there's quite a bit of a sadness to Marcus Garvey's political beliefs. He was quite defeatist. He believed that African Americans would never be able to become true equals in America, and that's why he wanted these African American communities to separate and eventually emigrate back to Africa. But we can't deny that his philosophy focused on self-determination and the importance that African Americans could control and determine their own lives. Another key group is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Now, this one was founded a bit earlier in 1909, but like Garvey's UNIA movement, it became very prominent in the 1920s onward. It has some initial early leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, who were really instrumental in the NAACP's formation. They wanted to end racial segregation and discrimination, and they wanted to focus on the legal routes they could do that. Let's focus on parades in the streets. They wanted to go to the courts and challenge these unjust laws directly to really fight for those equal rights. During the 1920s, the NAACP worked on various civil rights issues, such as working on removing the lynching campaigns that had occurred and also getting rid of other discriminatory laws as well. Above all, they wanted integration and equality for all the races. They wanted to remove any discriminatory laws that were in place, although they did focus on the African American concerns, especially in the southern states. They played a crucial role in the formation of what would eventually become the civil rights movement, and we'll say a lot more about this group as we get into the 1950s and 1960s especially. And the last group I want to make a mention to is the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, or the BSCP, led by Philip Randolph. Now, this one is quite an interesting group to note. They were made up of 18,000 portsmen all the way out throughout the country, not just in America, but also in Canada and other railway networks as well. And this was a labor union movement, one that really focused on the workers and creating support for them. They were widespread in their influence. As I say, this railway network spread all the way out throughout America. And so Randolph really wanted to help all the workers everywhere get not just their workers' rights, but also a better economic situation as well. Randolph, in particular, will really use the sleeping car porters to try and advance civil rights further in later campaigns. Let's bring it all together now and consider the situation for the African Americans across all of America by the early 1930s. So the northern states were less African Americans living here, but they did have more job opportunities, they did have more integration, they were away from those Jim Crow segregation laws that were plaguing the southern states. They lived predominantly in cities, and so they did crowd themselves together. They could vote, they did have suffrage, and they actually could join various unions. UNIA was quite popular in the northern states. However, there were some hindrances for them. They were still quite poor. They had an income below the average, especially the white workers' wage. And they also, because of the nature of so many African Americans moving up north, they eventually got crowded into the ghettos. And so we end up with a de facto segregation scenario. So while de jure in law, there was no real segregation practiced up north, the de facto, in truth, the reality was they did face segregation because of the living conditions and because they couldn't afford to live in any wealthy areas. Conversely, this still looks a lot better than life in the southern states, where about 90% of African Americans remain stuck in. Many of them are trapped as poor sharecroppers, so they work on land they do not own and they help out white workers who employ them, and it really leaves them in that kind of impoverished situation. The Jim Crow laws also make sure that in de jure fashion, in law, they are still segregated. Their education, especially, is really downright awful, and they can many African Americans try and learn to read and write and get more qualified jobs in these southern states. Any efforts they do try and make on the voting scene, they struggle to do because of literacy tests that they can't pass, and the poll tax that makes sure because they're poor, they just lack the suffrage regardless. The law, therefore, is disproportionately favouring the whites. There are many tragic cases where things like the KKK are still lynching the African Americans that live here. It's just an awful situation to be in. But this is why groups like the NAACP really focus on campaigning in these southern states. They know the conditions are awful and really want to fix that and change the laws for the better. Again, we've had many decades of nigh inactivity for African American progress, especially in regards to the law. And so the NAACP want to change that and really want to make a battleground in these African American states down south. But as I said, there is sadly going to be a scenario that's going to happen in the 1930s that really does test the American government. And it's going to affect not just the African American community, but the entirety of America at large. This is the Great Depression. This is the Wall Street crash. And that's what we're going to explore in our video in our next lesson. So, yes, do remember the situation for the African Americans, both in the northern and southern states going forward. Hope to see you on my next lesson where we go into the Great Depression and the action of the New Deal, how it tries to address the struggles of the African American and what it can do for them. Thank you as always for watching. I hope you found this insightful. Do make sure you subscribe so you keep on top of our lessons in this series as we go forward throughout the term. This is History with Sire. Thank you for listening.